Hey guys, my name is Roman, and I'm going to be doing my presentation on the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. That was a historical marker that I chose. That's what I'm going to be talking about today. So we're going to talk about the Southern Christian Leadership Conference and how they accomplished its goal. The goal of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference was to help fight desegregation and to help achieve voting rights for African Americans. Back then, that was like not heard of, non-existent, and many African Americans were fighting for it, and they were getting nowhere. So out of that came the civil rights movement. The civil rights movement in the 1950s and 60s was probably the biggest movement, like, of the modern world. Just African American people were tired of being treated how they were. They were sick of the racism and injustice that they faced, which they faced a lot, especially in the South, in Georgia. White supremacy was rampant. Just the states were rife with racism and injustice. So they wanted to fight that. Out of all of that, there came many organizations. Like, out of all that arose many organizations, and probably the biggest one was the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. The Southern Christian Leadership Conference was led by Martin Luther King Jr., and he had a lot of people behind him, but they all had one goal in mind, and that was obviously, like I said before, to fight desegregation and to get them their voting rights. So what was the background and the purpose of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference? My first point being the African American population and its frustrations of lack of equal rights and voting restrictions. So like I talked about earlier, they were very frustrated. They wanted to be treated equally. They wanted their voting rights. They wanted to be not segregated. That was extremely racist. I mentioned before, racism and injustice were everywhere. The difference with the Southern Christian Leadership Conference was that they wanted to do this in a nonviolent way. So their idea was not to resort to violence, but to go more towards a nonviolent way. So that's why I put the difference between violence and nonviolence. And of course, they were led by Martin Luther King Jr. What started it? So there was a few events that led up to the SCLC being started, and one of the most major ones that everybody knows about was Rosa Parks. Everybody knows the story about Rosa Parks being on the bus, and she refused to give her seat up to a white person, as was like the standard back in the day. Not the standard, but that's just what the rules were in Montgomery, Alabama, which is a highly racist area. And she was arrested. And from that sparked a lot of outrage, and activists sprang into action, and they began the Montgomery bus boycott. MLK and a lot of ministers were behind it. The one thing about the Southern Christian Leadership Conference was the word Christian. They wanted to keep those Christian principles, which is why it became a whole non-violent thing. Like, that's what non-violence was one of their biggest pushers, I guess. I don't know how to explain it. Just because it had the word Christian in it, and they wanted to do it peacefully. So how was this non-violence demonstrated? So there was demonstrated through a few different strategies. They had sit-ins, they had voter registration drives, and they also had marches, like protests, obviously peaceful protests. They were mostly peaceful, but obviously there's a lot of obstacles in the way. A lot of white supremacists didn't like what they were doing, so they would try to interfere with that, and there would come clashes from that, but it's nothing that came from the group itself. So I have a picture right here of one of the sit-ins. I can't tell from this picture, But at these sit-ins, there was one where MLK joined students at the Magnolia Tea Room. It was in downtown Atlanta, and they would sit there in protest. They would occupy all the seats, and eventually they would come and just get arrested. And actually, MLK himself got arrested at one of these sit-ins. So that was a big deal. Also, just real quick, I just want to show you guys a picture of Rosa Parks also on the bus. That was her. I think that was taken already after everything happened. And some of you may ask, what did it even accomplish? There was actually a lot that was accomplished. First of all, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference brought, and its nonviolent protests brought a lot of national attention to the civil rights movement. All eyes basically came onto the civil rights movement. Everybody was looking, seeing what was happening and what was going to happen. And the Congress and President obviously took notice. And eventually they passed the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And it changed everything for generations to come. It wasn't perfect. And here's like a picture of the bill being signed into law. It wasn't perfect, but it was definitely a step in the right direction for everybody. And it, like I said, it changed the lives of many people to come. My conclusion was that the nonviolence worked. You didn't have to resort to violence to get your point across. They didn't have to resort to violence to get the point across. And the goals of segregation and voting rights became accomplished. Maybe not completely and fully, but just that structure, the idea, like giving African Americans that right, it was accomplished. It showed the nation what organization and mobilization could do if it was done effectively, which the SCLC did. And to this day, they still do things. That organization, it definitely took a fall after. It declined in what it used to be, but it still has an effect to this day. So that's my presentation on the SCLC.